Nigerians worse off than they were over 60 years ago? In a stark assessment of Nigeria's economic trajectory, African Development Bank President Dr. Akinwumi Adesina revealed that the nation's GDP per capita has declined to $824, a figure lower than the $1,847 recorded at independence in 1960. This, he said, last Thursday following the keynote address at the 20th anniversary dinner of investment firm Chapel Hill Denham in Lagos. The alarming statistics underscores decades of policy missteps, over-reliance on crude oil, and chronic underinvestment in critical sectors. GDP per capita brings all the finished goods and services our country produces for a period, calculated in monetary value, and divides that by our population. It's a metric that breaks down our economic output to a per-person allocation, and it's used as a snapshot of the country's economic well-being. International Monetary Fund reported that it has fallen to $835. This is a substantial decline from its 2023 range of $1,597 to $2,460. And despite being Africa's largest economy by GDP, Nigeria's economic structure remains deeply flawed and unsustainable, necessitating urgent reforms to avert further decline. Segun Sopitan, principal partner at Woodridge and Scott Consulting, joins me now for the conversation. It's a pleasure to have you in.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Right. So, based off of additional statements, can we identify specifically what some of these issues are that is perhaps dragging down, our per capita, GDP per capita?
Wow, that's a very broad angle to look at it from. I think that you can't have this conversation without delving into the governance issues that we have as a country, because, when Dr. Adesina says we're worse off than we were 65 years ago, that's a damning testimony as to how badly we've done as a country. And the only way to look at that is to look at the governance issues, because the whole point of governance is to bring development, economic development and inclusive development and growth. So obviously that hasn't happened.
What policies would you say have sort of derailed us? Because he highlighted policy missteps, right? Are there specific policies across the span of 65 years that have steered us off course?
Absolutely. I think that one of the biggest missteps that we've had is that we have not focused on productivity and production of our people as against pursuing economic statistics. And it's a mistake we're still making today, So we look at the economic question and we say, what's GDP? What's per capita GDP that we're talking about right now? What's interest rate? What's inflation? Those things are supposed to be a measure of how you're doing, but in themselves, whether they're positive or negative, don't really say much.
So we're focusing too much on the numbers than
actual people, than actual development initiatives. So for example, where are we with electricity? Dr. Adesina spoke about that, and I've been talking about that on as many platforms as I've had the opportunity to speak. You can't have development if you don't have electricity. It's simply impossible. And if we just take a snapshot of 1999 till today, we haven't moved. Our production, distribution, transmission has hovered around 5,000 megawatts. I mean, that's absolutely crazy. How can we develop? And at the same time, our population has almost doubled.
Right. We're going to get to that.
Because it's a per capita thing we're talking about. So we're not generating, let's just focus on the power alone. We're not generating enough power to drive the productive activities that will lead to development, that will create wealth. Because again, per capita GDP is a measurement of wealth. So the barber, the hairdresser, the vulcanizer, just name any vocational area of activity, they need electricity. The baker, the restaurateur, and so on and so forth. So if everybody is relying on generators, fueling them at exorbitant rates now, or having to rely on alternative power sources that are simply too expensive to get, you will not have the kind of development that you need. So I think the mistake that our governments successively have made is that we have not put in enough energy, enough thinking work into how to ramp up the numbers in these fundamental infrastructural requirements that will drive development. We just simply have not done enough. We've not unleashed private capital, for example. How do we think? What kind of thinking can we put in place that will bring private money into these sectors, the way we've seen it happen.
FDIs, or...
I'm not even talking about FDIs or FPIs. I'm just talking even local investments. I mean, for goodness sake, Dangote refinery is $20 billion invested by a Nigerian. And we have, the number of rich people that we have in Nigeria, we all know these things. So what are we doing about dragging, this money into these critical sectors to ensure that we can achieve the goals and objectives that we have as a country? We've not done enough.
Yeah, I recall someone saying that power sector reform should have preceded telcos and banking sector reforms and all that. You highlighted production, that we're focusing too much on the numbers than on actual production. And we know that oil production has been something that we have focused on. How damning, or how much of an effect has that focus on oil production and the oil sector, how do you think that has affected us, our economy as a whole, that overdependence there?
It's they call it the Dutch curse. You have one resource in abundance, and as a result of that, you forget everything else. The old story about how we used to rely on agriculture a lot for export earnings and how oil destroyed all of that is very well told. So what we've done, oil in itself is not a problem, but the problem is the laziness of our public officials who have seen easy money and have stopped thinking.
Right.
That's simply what's happened. So we had the oil. We should have leveraged that opportunity, take that money, and use it to create a base for future wealth, such that oil, because oil will finish now. It's a wasted result. It's a wasted result.
And the prices are going down anyway.
The prices are going down anyway. We have a fixed volume of reserves, of oil reserves under the earth in Nigeria. There are resources that you can unlock that are completely limitless. They are renewable. Agriculture is one of them, if you mechanize it. Right. Human resources, innovation, tech, in the tech space, those things can never finish. So, how do we harness all of those things by government policy and regulation to improve the well-being of Nigerians? I think that's one of the areas that oil has really kept us in a trap. And it's up to a decisive leader to break that.
Yeah. And sticking with the numbers now, I know you said that we shouldn't be focusing so much on numbers, right?
About them because
Adesina made bold to compare Nigeria's performance with that of South Korea, saying that 1960 they were far below our GDP per capita, but right now they're $32,000. Is that a fair comparison, first of all? And then how are we faring along with our African counterparts? Is it an African problem? Is it just a Nigerian problem?
Yeah, it's an interesting point you raised, because I was actually thinking about it as I was on my way here. First, it's a fair comparison, because South Korea, are they not human beings living on the planet Earth? And how are they different from us? If they've been able to grow their per capita GDP, the wealth of their people, by 1,000-fold in 65 years, why has ours reduced? Because they're human beings too, like us. What are they doing differently? We have to learn from that. And it's not just South Korea. You can take the examples of the Asian tigers, Malaysia, the Indonesians, many of whom we were either at par with or even better than in 1960. But today, they're all either emerging markets or first world countries. And here we are, where we are. So we do, it shows that we've done something fundamentally, drastically wrong in that time. And then to compare with our African, peers, per capita GDP in South Africa today is $6,000. It's low, but that's multiples of where we are.
Right.
Botswana is $7,000. Botswana, Gabon is $5,000.
And we the giants of Africa.
And we're supposed to be the giants of Africa.
Right.
Of course, there's, somebody will quickly quip and say, oh, no, it's because of our population.
I was going to come to that.
But that's not, that's escapism, because the population in itself is a resource.
So it's not a fair argument to say, because typically countries with more industry, smaller populations, they often turn out with higher GDP per capita. So would you say it's not a fair consideration that we have such a large, population? So by the time you do the math, we're down a lot.
I mean, the United States of America, the population is 350 million. And their per capita GDP is 78,000.
Are we comparing ourselves with America?
Well, we should, we can give ourselves some leeway and some slack because of the journey they've had and where we are in our journey. But again, I repeat, it's a planet on, it's a country on the planet Earth, the same planet we inhabit. So what are they doing right that we're doing wrong, and how can we learn from the experiences? I'm not saying we should be at $80,000, but for goodness sake, how can we be going backwards? So if you compare with the African peers, there seems to be some sort of commonality in terms of the growth trajectory across the African continent. I looked at Rwanda, for example, who people say is doing fantastically well, but guess what? Rwanda's per capita GDP is still somewhere around $2,500, as against about $500 in 1960. So there are problems there. We've got to ask what's happening on the African continent. Right. There's a governance problem, clearly. There's a leadership problem. And I think, if you look at the connection between governance and economic prosperity and GDP growth, there is a direct relationship. The better the governance systems and democratic culture and norms in a society, it seems as if there's a correlation that it results in development.
Yeah, I think we're coming to the solutions already, and we'll do so after the break. But we know that the presidency has come out to counter what Adesina said. We know that Adesina, he did say that Nigerians are faring, they're worse off than they were in 1960. The presidency has come out to counter that, highlighting disparities in the data. For example, we talked about the population. We know that our population has grown significantly. But I want to quote, what he said specifically on X. That's Bayo Onanuga, spokesperson. Available data: our country's GDP was $4.2 billion in 1960, and per capita income for a population of 44.9 million was $93. Not even over 100. Our country's GDP did not rise remarkably until 1970s, when crude earnings ballooned. In 1970, our GDP rose to $12.55 trillion, and of course, he goes on to cite the data. In 2014, after rebasing, it reached an all-time high of $3,200. This fact raised questions about the source of Dr. Adesina's figures. That's from SA Information Strategy by Onanuga. What do you have to say to that countering the African Development Bank presidents, the outgoing African Development Bank's presidents?
I honestly don't know how you want to argue against data. Dr. Adesina quoted data.
He has also quoted his own data.
The data he's quoted is that things got better along the way. But the question is, are they still better now? That's the point Adesina is making. I looked at the numbers as well, and I saw that in 2014, our per capita GDP was $3,300. In I forget the year now, I think 2000 and I think it was 1980. We actually hit about $2,000 as well, 2,100, right?
Right.
But the question, the issue is that if you look at that chart, it's peaked in 2014, and it's been a downward, it's a sharp, steep drop, since then.
What was it
we are now.
About 2014?
It's the rebasing, like he said, is right. I mean, it's the fact that we simply changed how we're calculating GDP at that time. So it's not as if something fundamental happened to grow the GDP base of the country. If we want to look at a time when that happened, then we have to look at 2020, when we created the GSM revolution. Right. That created a new economy.
Yeah, we have to go on a break now. And of course, we'll also talk about, obviously, there's been another GDP rebasing. And we'll talk about that and perhaps how that could change things after the break. It's still Business Edge. The conversation continues in just a moment. All right, you're still tuned into Business Edge. Right now, we are talking, are Nigerians faring better or worse off than they were in 1960? The presidency has responded, countering what Adesina said. We do have with us Segun Sopitan, principal partner, Woodridge and Scott Consulting, with us. And to pick up from where we left off, obviously, the counter from the presidency citing their data, and perhaps you said they were just citing the in-betweens, not necessarily where we are now. Speaking of where we are now, GDP rebasing, how do you see that changing all the data when it comes to GDP per capita going forward?
Well, I mean, it would be a good thing to rebase our GDP. It was done last in 2014, as we just said, and typically best practice globally is you should do this every 5 years, 5 to 7 years, thereabouts. Because the dynamics and the structure of the economy tends to change, and you want to make sure you're capturing everything that's happened. So you need to capture new business areas, new industries, and so on and so forth. So hopefully we'll do that, and that will tell a more accurate story of where we are as a country in terms of economic output. But until then, it is what it is. Yes. And until then, We're number 4 in Africa. Our GDP is actually less than $200 billion US. That's atrocious. We're behind Algeria. We're behind, I think, Morocco, South Africa, and Egypt. Sorry, Algeria, South Africa, and Egypt. You know, so and we are supposed to be the giants of Africa. So hopefully, when we do rebase the GDP, that will change, but we don't know by how much. The reason this is the way it is because the government valued the naira, floated it, which is also, and it must be said, it's also part of the reason that the per capita GDP is as low as it is.
Right. And speaking of what this current administration is, doing, you've highlighted just a bit of it. Would you say, obviously, one of the things highlighted as, the reason as to why we're where we are is because of the policy missteps. This administration has adopted fresh policies that are shaking the economy up. Would you say we're on the path to retracing our steps, or the missteps?
I think what this government has done is gone the same way that we've been going, relying on guidance and advice from institutions that have not traditionally been known to be looking out for the interest of the developing world, IMF and the World Bank. You can't build your economic policy on the advice of those institutions. You can reference them, but you can't take what they're saying, hook, line, and sinker, and implement it. Nobody has ever done that in Nigeria until this administration.
So solution, right? Yes. In 1 minute,
yes.
What can we do to retrace our steps, build stronger institutions?
So what we need to do, first of all, is to abandon this trajectory of talking about floating the naira, talking about, yes, we've got to talking about taking subsidies away. Subsidies are a critical part of driving consumption and development.
Petrol subsidy?
All subsidies.
Should bring it back?
Well, I mean, it's too late in the day. The horse has left the stable. I don't think we can bring it back, but we cannot continue down that trajectory. What we need to do right now, I said on another platform, we need to see a Nigeria that is one massive construction site. In all sectors. We need to see roads coming up, in the next 2 years before the end of this administration. A lot can still be done. Right. We need to see electricity go up to at least 10,000 megawatts before the end of 2027. It can happen. We simply need to bring in the capital. The problem is, people say, how do you fund it? Because we say the government is bankrupt. That's in fact why we floated the naira, why we removed subsidy. It was a wrong step. What we needed to have done was to unleash private money. We have a lot of it. Let government put in tax incentives, tax holiday policies, and all of those types of things that will encourage and drive investment into those particular sectors. Can we have another Dangote in the electricity sector that is building power, generating plants, that is building mini grids across the country, and so on and so forth. So if you create enough infrastructure development to bridge the heavy deficits we have across the different infrastructure sectors, then you will have economic growth.
Reforms.
And that's it.
Yes, reforms will continue, hopefully, Absolutely. And we'll see that needed change. Thank you very much. Segun Sopitan, Principal Partner, Woodridge and Scott Consulting. Thank you for joining us.